firstly, thank you all for coming, and thank you to the speakers for making time to be with us today. Hopefully throughout the day, we'll kind of start off very broad, talking about the landscape, and gradually sort of filter down through the day and provide a bit more granularity around sort of thoughts around sort of the regulatory situation, how to approach testing, and we've also got a business that is going to talk to you about sort of the clinical side of things, clinical investigation and evaluation, which is something we don't do. So just to introduce the speakers for the next session, so I'm Michael. I'm the one of the medical directors for the business at Element. My background is about 10 years in industry, working for Boston Scientific, Biotronic, then worked for MHRA, so the regulator, for a few years, where I got to work with Ashleigh and Nicole and Phil and some other people in the audience today, Feza. Then moved to Innovate UK, so the UK's innovation agency, where I ran one of the funding programs before coming to Element. And part of the driver for me coming to Element was actually the experience during the pandemic with ventilators and supporting Ventilator Challenge and CPAP and other products, where worked with James and worked with kind of Neil and various others, and got kind of frustrated actually around how challenging it was for businesses to get that clarity around what they needed to do, and also kind of a slight frustration at the process as well. So really we came to Element partly to try and address some of those challenges and provide a much more sort of streamlined approach, which will take time, but that's the vision. So I'm going to just read from notes now to introduce the speakers, because I know them quite well and I'll go off on a tangent otherwise. So we'll start with Ashleigh Batchen, if you want to come up, Ashleigh. So Ashleigh's the Head of Regulatory Affairs at the British In Vitro Diagnostics Association, so BIVDA. We work together at MHRA. At BIVDA, she provides regulatory advice for IVD manufacturers, and as the trade body sort of feeds into sort of key discussions. At MHRA, she works on various roles, so in policy, post-market, and compliance of medical devices and IVDs, and she sits on a number of expert panels. Next up, we've got Phil Brown. Come on down. So Phil is the Director of Regulatory and Compliance at the Association for British Health Tech Industries, ABHI, and he joined ABHI in June 2016. So again, he's worked in a number of different environments. So he started off at Smith & Nephew, and he's worked across different technologies, worked with national authorities, the EU, trade associations. So he's got a real sort of broad mix of experience. He also chairs Standards Working Group TC210, which covers quality and risk standardization. He's also a fellow of TOPRA, so the Organisation for Professionals in Regulatory Affairs. Next up, we've got Eammon Hoxey. So Eammon is a technical author, trainer and consultant in life sciences areas, and covering regulatory compliance, quality management, sterility and standards development. Eammon has had over 16 years experience with MHRA. It's a bit of a theme here. Including 6 years as Head of Device Technology and Safety. He then went on to work at J&J for 17 years in a number of senior positions in quality and regulatory. He's currently the chair of SEN TC204, which is the Standards Committee for Sterilisation of Medical Devices, and was past chair of TC210, which is quality management and related general aspects. He also received the BSI Wolf-Barry Medal in 2016. Finally, we've got John Wilkinson, who is he's had again a broad set of experiences in industry. So he was director of devices at MHRA. He's chair of the board of trustees of GMDN, so the Global Medical Device Nomenclature. He's also worked in industry for BOC and sort of ran MedTech Europe for a number of years as well. He received the OBE in 2010 for services to the medical device industry. Whew. Right, now we can get on to the panel discussion. So we'll have Slido up, so if you want to ask questions through Slido anonymously, please do so. If you want to just stick your hand up at the end, we can do that as well. So what we're going to do as part of this discussion is really just talk a bit about the now, talk about what we can learn from the past, some of the challenges facing industry, and really sort of pick the brains of these incredibly experienced people to try and give you a sense of perhaps where some of the priorities are. So if we start off, I'm not really sure who to go with. I'll probably go with Ashleigh first, actually. But right now, in the current landscape, what do you see as the key challenges facing the health tech industry more broadly? And what do you see sort of stakeholders doing to try and address some of those challenges?
So hopefully this microphone's working. Yeah, thank you. So at BIVDA we have over 250 IVD companies that feed into various discussions, and my point of view on this matter is purely based on the feedback I've had so far from them. And the vast majority of them seem to be saying that the biggest challenge is the uncertainty. We don't know what's going on with the EU. There's still a lot of issues that are being ironed out there, both for IVDs and medical devices. And then the UK situation itself is also incredibly complex. We don't yet have the legislation with the new regulations in them, so it's difficult to plan for the future and implement strategies when you don't know what the requirements are going to be. So I'd say that's definitely the biggest challenge at the minute. And in terms of combating it, I think things like this are really beneficial, getting everybody in a room and having conversations. Okay, what are you doing on this? How are you solving this issue within your company? But the wider issue on it, and stakeholder-wise, is that we really need to be pushing forward with the regulators and with trade associations and other stakeholders to make sure that we get the information we need sooner rather than later.
Okay. Having heard from one trade body, we know we better hear from another one. So Phil, what are your thoughts?
Firstly, I have to say thank you, Michael, for the invite to come here today. Absolutely agree with everything that Ashleigh has just said. But allied to that, I think, is that we have to recognise as well that our industry has 95% SMEs, really small companies, and for them to actually understand and work with the regulations is quite hard. If you've just got a dozen people in your company, to actually have somebody who's understanding the real requirements as to how to work the regulations. Regulations are great. You can actually read through regulations, but how do you apply them? You know, it's like doing your driving test. You know, you can learn to drive, but then it's not until you've been driving for a while on the motorway that you realise that actually maybe I didn't quite understand what was going on. So to actually educate and to get that message across to people as to how to work those regulations, how to feed that into a business sort of environment is really key for those SMEs. There's a real lack of regulatory expertise within the system, and that's not just within companies. I mentioned SMEs, but there's a lack of experience and understanding within conformity assessment bodies. As we know, you've probably all had challenges trying to find people within conformity assessment bodies to do your work for you, but then also within the regulator, and that's not a fault of any of those stakeholders. It's just the way that the environment has grown up, and the environment for the need for regulation has become greater, and unfortunately for us as an industry, Ashleigh, I hope you agree, what that has done, along with the uncertainty, is to drive a lot of the real essence of medical technology is outside of Europe now. You know, when we think of the old medical device directive, it was great. We were all working with that, and everybody was coming to Europe to innovate and to get their products on the market and all that sort of stuff. Now, because of this unpredictability and the lack of experience and lack of capacity, everybody's saying, well, actually, I could probably do better innovating my products somewhere else in the world. So that's the real challenge I think that we're facing.
So, so just picking up on that point, you know, we didn't have regulation. Well, the directives, first one came in what, 1990? So kind of looking backwards, so we're in a situation at the moment where there's perhaps challenges around capacity, around kind of how companies navigate the requirements and stuff. Is there anything we can learn, potentially learn from the past? So kind of looking back, what was good? What could we relearn from the past? So John, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the MDD was a profound success at the time because it was a reasonably cost-effective framework for introducing regulation, as opposed to the FDA's approach, which was required cohorts of people to bring the thing to function effectively. So the MDD was a profound step forward. Arguably, it was a failure of implementation at the time. It wasn't implemented as well as it might be over the course of the next 20 years. And some of those failures of implementation were exploited and eventually led to possibly an overreaction with the MDR. And I fear that we're going through the same process with MDR, which is a failure of implementation. For a lot of the reasons that have been described here. It's when you go from 50 pages of legislation to 500 plus multiples of that in terms of guidance and everything else, you need a huge workforce to be able to deliver that. You also need a coordinated system, and that's one of the weaknesses of Europe, I think, is the accountability for delivery. So you end up, when things go wrong, the various bits looking at each other and saying, well, it's, you should have done this, you should have done this. And I think the accountability issue is the biggest challenge going forward. How do you plan implementation effectively so that you deliver what was intended at the outset? And I'm not sure we're getting any further forward with that, quite frankly. I think structurally it's unsound.
I mean, are devices significantly safer today than they were 30 years ago, or maybe carried on to Eammon? So any other learnings from either kind of either early on or maybe more recently through the pandemic? Any thoughts?
Thanks, Michael. It's an interesting stage in your career when you always get asked the questions to look backwards rather than to look forwards as to what's gonna happen. I mean, I think to building on a couple of points that have been made, to John's point, all of the regulations have been a reaction to something that's gone wrong. I mean, even if you go back through all the medical device, all of the pharmaceutical regulations, they're inevitably trying to fix yesterday's problems or 5 years ago's problems, and very rarely addressing tomorrow's problems. And so you always end up with a kind of overreaction, I think, as John said. So that's something to always bear in mind. And I think on the uncertainty point, I'd just add, I think one of the things that I saw and have seen is when you get this uncertainty, it's very difficult to get the top management of companies to address something when the answer to every one of their questions is it depends. They want answers, they want to know what they have to do, where they have to put investment, and if you don't know, and you don't know what's going to happen, you can't get them to make those decisions. Certainly in big companies, and I'm sure it's the same in small companies. Yeah. So I think to me, what was on Phil and John's point, what was good about the directives was it set a framework, but it didn't have that much detail in it. That led to some problems which were you can kind of say were always going to happen. You couldn't predict which ones they'd be, but if you look historically, something's gonna happen. There'll be a reaction to it. Then you get a big overreaction, and you maybe fix all the old problems, but you still haven't fixed what tomorrow's big problem is going to be. We don't know. It's in Donald Rumsfeld's words, it's an unknown unknown. You can't predict what it's going to be. You're going to need system that's flexible enough to be able to deal with it without trying to change the regulations again immediately, because it'll take you 5 years to do it, and then you'll have a 10-year implementation period, and you'll be 15 years past the problem before you're able to fix it, or through a regulatory route.
Okay, so so today we're not kind of just looking at EU and UK. We are kind of looking at sort of global environments as well. So if you've got questions sort of on a more global context, and that's cool as well. But looking at the questions on the board, So in the UK, we are currently waiting for a bit of clarity from MHRA in terms of what the future landscape looks like in the UK for medical devices. There was also some recommendations published by the Life Sciences Advisory Group recently, which kind of perhaps point the way. But anyone got any thoughts in terms of what the future kind of regulation of devices in the UK might look like? Anyone want to take that on? Not that I'm looking at you for any particular reason there, Phil.
Do you know, the other document which was really key was the output of the consultation that was held on, that the MHRA held on the future of regulation, which was, end of 2021, I think the output of that was. And it'd be interesting to know what people thought about that. When we looked at the answers which came out from that consultation, we looked at it and sort of said, well, is this just a safe, conservative way of looking at regulation, sort of basing everything on European sort of processes and stuff? And of course, all of the big manufacturers who we were talking to within our membership were saying, we've got to have alignment with Europe, we've got to do this, we've got to have consistency with Europe. And absolutely understand that. From a technological perspective or a technical perspective, of course you have to have alignment. But in order to sort of ensure that your global development processes are consistent, that you're not duplicating effort, you're not sort of spending more money than you should do. But then if you look at global regulation in general, and you look at the outputs of groups such as the IMDRF, those essential principles are essentially just lifted out of IMDRF guidelines and put into the MDR. So everything that's in that sort of global drift is along the same sorts of lines. And when we looked at those regulations, about a 90% commonality across a lot of those jurisdictions. So it really is just down to process. And to your point, John, should, in fact, at that point, at the end of that consultation, should the MHRA have been braver and said, look, we know that there is this technical alignment, but should we actually align with a process in Europe which we know is being challenged from a capacity perspective and from a process perspective? So it's at that point that we started, as you mentioned, Michael, to start thinking about how that could develop as a process, not necessarily changing the way that we technically deal with products from a quality, safety and performance perspective, but how we actually transition those products through to the patient. And that was the basis really of a lot of those Life Science Council proposals, as you mentioned, to get to the nub of that, recognising ultimately, because we're in Coventry, recognising the UK is only 3% of a global market.
Yeah, Ashleigh, I think alongside that, just to expand it a bit, the recognition I think is important, and there's a question around sort of MDR, EU MDR. So MDR is medical device regulation, by the way, if anyone's unclear, so that's regulation EU 2017-745. So if you could kind of expand on the point, maybe talk about EU, but then sort of the global context and harmonisation.
Yeah, sure. So I just want to kind of follow on to Phil's point, because I think it's also important to remember that when the MDR and IVDR were developed for Europe, the UK was still a part of the EU. The UK was instrumental in developing both of those pieces of legislation, right? So a lot of it is reflective of what would be required within a UK setting, which is kind of, I think, why MHRA are going down the track of, not necessarily it's the path of least resistance, because I think politically it probably isn't the path of least resistance, but it aligns in terms of what they're looking to get for patients within the UK. So that's just a really kind of important point to tack onto it. And we certainly had the same feedback from our membership that alignment to the EU regulations was what was wanted by industry. On a larger scale, in terms of what we might see in the UK and things we might be able to pick out of it, the EU system is certainly not perfect. There is a lot of issues, as I'm sure a lot of people in this room and online are well aware of. So I think that the UK has the possibility now to take the best parts of various different pieces of legislation, not just the EU, but US, Australia, Canada, whichever markets there are, and form kind of a super regulation with all of those best parts. Now, the difficulty with that is what Phil was saying about then you've got manufacturers having to comply with different sets of rules across different geographic areas, and from a commercial point of view, that's very difficult to do and very costly to do. So then you have to have the balance of how does this affect businesses in the UK, and are we still going to drive companies to come to the UK to place on the market? So I think MHRA is in a very, very difficult position at the minute, trying to balance all of those various pieces. And I'm hopeful that whatever regulation we get will have the best interests of patients at the heart of it, and be realistic and manageable for industry.
So Eammon, I just want to come to you quickly. So on the whole, we're talking about engineering products. We can sort of talk about software as a medical device and stuff, but putting that to one side for a second, we're talking about engineering products. So standards play a key role in that. So from a global context, I mean, where are we going sort of globally in terms of standards, and what role do you see there in terms of helping drive a bit more harmonisation?
Well, I think that the standards have essentially gone down a harmonisation route. I mean, most of the standards are international standards which are adopted as European standards, which are adopted as British standards. Yeah. That's certainly in the medical device area, that's sort of 95% of them. So they're in some ways leading the way on harmonisation, and it leads to the point that I think that Phil was making, that actually the requirements for the products are often pretty similar across the jurisdictions. It seems to me, going back to the original question, that the UK has to recognise that there is no single country that can do all of the enforcement compliance work for every single product. The US, the FDA, is probably the largest regulator in the world. They don't do all of their statutory inspections in the time frame that they're required to do it. You know, nobody can do everything. So they either have to work together some way or accept each other's work in some way. And the UK, as a tiny market, is never, ever going to be able to do everything on its own like we did in the 1980s. You know, it's just frankly not going to happen. So you're going to have to look at how do you accept some other, you know, despite the political rhetoric about not being rule takers, we're going to be rule takers. We're going to have to accept CE mark products from the EU. It seems to me we're going to end up accepting FDA approved or cleared products from the US. And that leaves you to, in my mind, looking at then what do you do for the small British companies that aren't looking initially at an international market, and how do they get onto the UK market without going through FDA or a notified body?
So we're rapidly running out of time. So very quickly, just maybe one thought. If you're a business that's already on the market, or you're starting off on your journey, what's sort of maybe like the key thing for businesses to think around, or a bit of advice for them?
I mean, to me, if I were in that situation, I'd be looking at how do I not do things twice. So I'd start off looking at, I mean, I come from a QA, quality management system background. I'd look at having some system of document and management control so that my documents and records are valid and I can demonstrate their validity. I'd look at the design and development process. That's not the research design and development, it's the design and development process. I'd look at what are the design inputs, what's the user requirements, what are the essential principles, make sure those are design inputs, and then start looking at what verification processes I need to put in place to verify that my outputs meet those inputs. That's where I would start off, to avoid getting 3/4 of the way down the line and then find something I did 6 months ago I can't use from a compliance point of view.
Yeah. John, your thoughts?
I'm going to be a bit broader than that, but I think it often comes down to clinical evidence and really having a clear view of what evidence you're going to need, and having a clear plan about how you're going to get that evidence, and linking that potentially to health technology assessment, which in the end, you know, somebody's got to buy these products that you're producing, and if you're producing something which is massively regulatory compliant but not a viable business proposition. So I think get onto those things early, even if it's only modelling it in a sort of back of a fag packet way, but do it early and try and get your data and evidence collection aligned, because actually some of the evidence you're using for regulatory purposes may well be very good for the market entry and HDA stuff.
Phil?
I think you're talking about opportunities here, so let's talk about opportunities rather than challenges. And I think that we're really excited by programs such as IDAP, Investigational Device Access Pathways, and sort of seeing for the first time, as you were mentioning, John, that interaction between regulatory approval with health technology assessment through NICE, with those pathways through to the patients. And we mustn't forget that as Ashleigh said, that patients are at the heart of all of this. Patients in the UK have to have the most up-to-date products, otherwise they're going to be unhappy.